Hello, my name is Heather. Welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. I make videos mostly about UK left politics, and within that I kind of niche around the way in which anti-Semitism has been used to attack the left and the Labour Party. But I think since 7th of October, that kind of transformation of anti-Semitism that I was speaking about has gone into overdrive, and something which the transformation is from something which should be about anti-racism, opposing anti-Semitism, to turning that into something which is racist, which is used to attack black and brown people, which is used to support ethnic cleansing, apartheid, genocide now. And I think I've struggled to work out what to make videos about and what to say after, since the genocide started against Palestinians. So it's nice to be here with my friend Miriam David. Hello.
Hello, Heather.
Welcome to my channel.
Oh, thank you. I'm very pleased to be joining you on it today.
We've actually known each other for quite a long time in our previous lives as academics doing
Yes.
stuff on gender and education.
I think we've known each other about 20 years.
My gosh, yes, you're probably right. Yes, that's a long time. So now we're kind of in different lives and we're much more focused on politics, and we're going to really talk about that. And we're also going to talk about like your journey away from Zionism, because it does feel like it's an urgent political project right now to distinguish Jewishness from Zionism, to say that Zionism is not part of Jewishness for all of us.
Yes.
Yeah. So in light of that, hopefully you find this interesting discussion, and we're going to start off with you being, I guess, very Zionist growing up. I read something, and we'll put a link in the description below this video to something else that's about your journey away from Zionism. You described yourself as being brought up as a pucker Zionist.
Yes. I don't know why I use the phrase pucker Zionist, but it just seemed to fit, and the more we talk about it, it seems to fit now, because it comes from notions of the Raj in India. Pucker is an India word, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's kind of an imperialist word about the nature of the world, and Zionism, I've only just begun to think about it in this way because I found addressing the question of settler colonialism really, really hard. And I was brought up wanting to be a settler colonialist Zionist. And I didn't really think about it. I didn't question it. I didn't think there was anything wrong with it. My family on both sides came from very Zionist backgrounds. And my parents met we were often told, in Habonim in the 1930s in Manchester.
So Habonim, for people who don't know, is a socialist Zionist youth movement.
Yes.
So we'll talk more about that later, because you have a history with it too, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's really my pucker Zionist background. Because, so when I was being brought up, my father was a refugee from Nazism, and he came to this country in 1936. My mother was the daughter of my grandmother, who was the only one of my grandparents I knew who had been born in Russia and what is now Ukraine. But we didn't know that then. And so the pair of them met and had a long courtship before they married, because my father was quite poor when he arrived and had to work and had to try and get his parents and his grandmother and aunt out of Germany, which he succeeded in doing. And so they had very different Jewish backgrounds, because my mother was very well educated, even went to Manchester University, which was rare for women in the early 1930s. My father was also at university in Berlin when he left Germany, but even so they had an educational background in common, a Jewish background in common, but very, very different social economic circumstances. But both of them, one of the things that brought them together was not only their Jewishness, but was their love of Zion, their desire to go and live in what was then Palestine and build it, but inability to do so for economic reasons. But that was always in the background. But my parents moved from their cosmopolitan backgrounds to live in this small town in West Yorkshire, and that we were the only Jews there. So being Jewish or whatever else we were was very much a family affair, and outside was a completely, I was about to use and I will use, alien community.
And then you moved from Keighley to Bradford, right?
Which was 10 miles away.
Yeah.
So 10 miles when I was 5 was a long way.
Yeah.
And
Bradford's very different, right?
Yes.
And let's go to more about how your Zionism kind of influenced things then. So Habonim, as we were saying, that's a left wing.
It was always described as a socialist Zionist youth movement.
Which seems strange, I think, to a lot of people on the left that you would bring these things together. But for a lot of people now as well, it's still going strong. But definitely of that generation, your generation, and after it was very, very popular, right?
Very, very. Well, it's interesting. It was both very popular and not so popular in the Jewish community. We were unusual in the small Bradford Jewish community. And Bradford wasn't that far from Leeds, which had an even much bigger Jewish community. And I think Habonim was very much a minority interest. But it was an extremely strong one for those who joined it. And so this friend of mine, Viv, she was almost a year older than me, but she and I joined when we were about 12, 13. And became really attached to it. It was a national movement.
Yeah.
We met people from London. That was and Manchester. That was amazing for us. We were 2 little girls from this tiny community, and we'd go to Manchester and meet people.
Okay, so tell me about I think people watching the video might not know what's involved in being a Zionist youth movement.
No, absolutely.
Particularly the socialist side of it. What did it involve?
The main idea was to go in what was by this time Israel. And the main thing we wanted to do, which is the other side of that, which is what made it socialist and carried on making it feel socialist for a very long time, was to go and live on kibbutz. It was not just to go and settle in Israel. It wasn't even to settle on a moshav, which is a collective farm, but where everybody has their own farm. A kibbutz was genuinely, at the time, I was always told, more than that kind of collective experience. You actually shared child rearing, you shared eating, you didn't live in your own little house, flat or whatever. Everything was shared. It was based on a Russian model of collective living, and that's what I really wanted to do, was to go and live on a kibbutz and share child rearing, share eating together. It was a vision of a much better way of living. I still hanker after it in a way.
So Tony Lerman writes in one of his books about going to live on one of the Habonim kibbutzim.
Yeah.
And what that experience was like and how it related to the theory and how it didn't. And it's a really interesting account. So again, I might put a link to that. I think it's
making and unmaking of a Zionist, isn't it?
It is indeed in that book. So so you've had this upbringing that's very much interlinking your politics with Zionism, your identity with Zionism, your aspirations, your hopes for your life, for how you want to live. And you also it also influenced your career, because your decision to take sociology was intertwined with that, right?
Yes, because there was somebody who'd already started. He came from Glasgow to Leeds University originally to read textiles. He then did this political theory course. He said, "Oh, well, I could teach you all some of that." So he came and he used to do it on a Sunday evening in my house.
Right.
And some of my school friends came to it. It must have been when I was in either the lower or upper sixth.
So that's years 12 and 13 now.
Yes,
right.
You still have to talk about it like that for me. But I fell in love with the whole thing. And as a result of him teaching us about Hobbes in particular, so I applied for sociology and ended up reading sociology and becoming a sociologist. And I felt the two things were very intertwined, because it was not just, I think it wasn't just the politics, I think it was our political theory that was important to me, rather than just activism. You see the difference. It was that I was interested in trying to develop a theory for my life, I suppose, and living. Not just for my life, for ways of living.
Like one thing which, like reading your account made me think about is how even when you leave Zionism behind, you can never really disentangle it from your life. Because if it's so much part of formative for you, and a lesser extent for me, but still very much there for me, that your decisions, your ways of thinking, they're all intertwined with Zionism. So it's very, very hard to do that kind of disentangling work that you have to do.
It's been hugely difficult, because he and I became leaders of a youth camp for Habonim.
Right.
I think we were about 13 or 14, and the camp was for 10, 12-year-olds. It's unimaginable that people would do that now. It was in Tenby Wells. No idea how many people there were there, but we were the leaders of it, and God knows how we were asked to be the leaders at that age. So that's another connection.
So where were we?
It was about the distinctive characteristics of Habonim, because it wasn't just Zionist, it was definitely left-wing Zionism, and a particular kind of left-wing nature of socialism that is not apparent on the left in this country, although I think that's still my vision, which is what I think you're teasing towards, asking me why it's still part of my life, because I still yearn for a more collective style of living, Jewish or not Jewish, than is possible in a capitalist society.
Okay, so you still yearn for that. Let's come back to that. Let's talk about how you moved away from Zionism and then come back to where you are now. So there was the 1967 war, was probably the next kind of landmark in
Yeah,
things.
I went to Leeds University, graduated in sociology. So I ended up coming to London to be a statistical research assistant. I was there for a year. The Six-Day War started, although Nera always tells me I shouldn't call it that anymore. I should just call it the 1967 war.
So Nera is a mutual friend of ours, Miriam David, who's also a remarkable researcher, and actually lives about 10 minutes walk from me. She was in my Labour Party branch. She was a political education officer for Hackney Central Labour Party branch. Neither of us are in the Labour Party now. But yeah, okay. 67 war, because Six-Day War is kind of Israeli propaganda, I guess, right?
It is.
I grew up with that idea, that propaganda of all the enemies of Israel attacked Israel, and then Israel amazingly beat them in 6 days, and wasn't that incredible? And our Israeli soldiers were the best.
Yeah,
that was all very much what I grew up with.
Exactly. But before the war started, there was huge build-up to it, and there was a huge anxiety and fear that Israel will be wiped out. And that's the propaganda I grew up with. And so my older sister and I were living together. We both decided to volunteer, because there was a huge campaign to get young Jewish people to volunteer to go and help in the war. And we were sent, first of all, to a moshav just on the outskirts of Jerusalem. Then we were sent to a kibbutz. So it was beginning of I thought my life was beginning to come together in that kind of way. But the kibbutz was more left-wing than the connection. There were 3 kibbutz movements in Israel, and they were connected to political parties. And the Habonim one was less left-wing. No idea what the distinction is now.
And how was it? I mean, like, you've been wanting to be on a kibbutz for a really long time. It's been a kind of idealised hope for you in terms of a way of living. How was the actual reality of it?
Not very good.
Right, that's what Tony says as well.
Well, I'd been to Israel before in 1963. I did very, very badly in my A-levels because I spent my time writing an essay to get a grant to go to. So I spent my time in Bradford Library learning about the history of Zionism, Socialist Zionism. I was just completely obsessed with it all. And I wrote this essay and I got this grant. But there was a lot of Socialist Zionism in the 19th century because it connected with the whole wave of nationalism throughout Europe, because it was a movement to create a land and a state. Just like there were other movements of Ukraine, I realise now, and all of those Russian satellite countries to have their own nationhood. So it wasn't completely. Now we think of Zionism as much more a capitalist endeavour, but the moves for nationhood were, because they were mainly East European, they were much more socialist oriented and came out of a form of Marxism. Quite a lot of the movements were Marxist rather than just socialist. So there was that connection there that seemed intellectually satisfying.
It's hard though to sort of say that all of that was both real and lies, if you know what I mean. There is a reality to it, that's people's experience of it.
There was a huge reality to it.
But it's also a corruption. I mean, Zionism, even in its socialist form, was about taking land away from people who lived there. It was about
it was about settler colonialism.
It was a settler colonial project, yeah.
Yes, and I never understood what that meant until because I've dismissed all the stuff I learned then, and I moved away from it, moved into feminism, and not connected my feminism and socialism like I did at the beginning.
But Jewishness is very much embedded in a lot of left politics, and I think we often forget that, right? Because Jewish people, particularly in this country, are so right-wing, the community's moved so right-wing, but the kind of generation that my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation were, they very left-wing. I mean, lots of communists, right?
Yes,
it was very.
It was incredibly, and so I'm very confused about it because the move to the right was, you're right, after 67, because in 67, and I suspect this was hugely Israeli propaganda. Sorry about my
There's a dog in the background.
He's upset that he's not allowed in. Israeli propaganda, and very few of the Jewish community, in my view, most of the Jewish community at that point in 67 were not interested in Zionism. It was only after 67 that the more right-wing elements of the Jewish community began to support Israel.
And so there was a kind of transition point for a lot of people, 67, right?
67 was a watershed,
I
think.
And it was the beginning of the occupation, which I think also for a lot of people moving away from Zionism was instrumental, right? The idea of Israel as an occupying power.
Yes, and because they never left the West Bank.
Also, of course, never left Gaza.
No, and they still haven't.
So how did you, because you're now not a Zionist, and in 2002, I know you were one of the founding members of Jews for Justice for Palestinians. And how did you get from where you were in 67, sort of wanting to volunteer to support Israel, to wanting to align with a very different kind of politics?
I still feel a very committed Jew. I don't want to give up being Jewish. Well, you can't.
You can't, no.
It's who I am.
Yeah, you're halakhically Jewish and culturally Jewish. Yeah.
But how you express that, I mean, I suppose the first thing about my socialist Zionism was the belief that the only way in which it will be easy to express myself being Jewish, which is all part of the Jewish colonialism, I guess you'd say, was it will be easiest in Israel when you were living amongst other Jews. Left you feeling marginal to wherever you were. So I was marginal to being a feminist as well as being Jewish. So it left you feeling a split identity. And I guess that's where tonality has helped, because you can be Jewish, you can be socialist, you can be a woman, and all of these identities come together. But when I was growing up, nobody had that kind of theory, that you had more than one identity. So after 67, I carried on being a researcher at London University, and I then went for a year to America, and I met a lot of far more Jewish people in America who were critical of all sorts of things, and it was very helpful to my identity. But then I came back to England and went to Bristol University, and that was my first academic job. It was there I met the man I married, called Robert Reiner. He was born in Hungary at the end of the war in 1946. When I met Robert, he was teaching sociology as well, so we thought we had very similar identities, but we struggled around what being Jewish, what being Zionist, and all these things were. I'm still very fond of him, but it was not an easy relationship. So that's where the struggle about what's Jewish, what's Zionist, who am I, started in that relationship. Sadly, it has had difficult effects on my children. That's all part of the move away from Zionism, because none of us have ended up there. And Robert and I divorced in the mid-90s. That gave me an opportunity to think again about my background, and I was very close friends of Irene Bruegel. Did you know Irene?
I didn't, but I know her work a bit.
Yeah. And Irene really was the driving force behind Jews for Justice for Palestinians. Right. All women as well. It was very much a feminist political Zionist. The other little bit I should mention is in my year in America, I met Miriam David. We were in a Jewish feminist group. Many of the people in our group were also in Our Bodies, Ourselves collective.
I will put a link to that as well, because that still goes on, that work, and that is an amazing project.
Fantastic project.
For women to stop having our bodies defined by male disciplines like medicine, and to have our own understandings of our bodies. Yeah.
To go back to your question, being Jewish and Zionist was being Jewish in particular, but there was an element of Zionism too, was very generative, is the word I want, to my life.
Yeah.
And so, although I've dropped lots of parts of it, I still feel it's been part of my existence. So October the 7th did give me a huge existential crisis.
Yeah, I think we should talk about that. I think a lot of Jewish people have struggled with it, in different ways.
But my struggle was, when I look back on it, I think I was horrified that it took me 10 days to remember that I had a cousin, a second cousin, but she's a double second cousin, because my father's cousin married my mother's cousin. And Margaret and I had spent a lot of time doing the family trees in that book.
Yeah.
And she did loads of research for me. And
there you go, book.
Thank you. And I finished it in August, September. So I wasn't in touch with her as much as I had been. So October the 7th came. I didn't think about her. And I didn't think about another friend of mine who didn't write to either of them for at least 10 days to find out how they were. Quite early on, I went to a Na'amod vigil in Hyde Park Corner. I'm not sure when that was. Maybe 2 weeks after. I don't know why it stung me. Well, I think I was horrified at how many women had been apparently raped and murdered. And
there's no evidence any women were raped on.
I know,
so there's absolutely no evidence at all.
There's very little evidence. There is the UN. The UN did that study very belatedly.
Which says there's no evidence.
Whatever it was, there was a woman who was also in Habonim from Canada who was killed. And a lot of people did talk about her murder being a kind of emblem of how horrific it was. But I do think what happened, although I was stunned for so long, was totally understandable given the history of Israel-Palestine, and in particular Israel-Gaza.
Yeah. Have you seen the film Zone of Interest?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean, so Zone of Interest is about people living next to Auschwitz.
Mm-hmm.
So more broadly, it's about how can we understand how people can live next to a place where people are being oppressed, murdered, starved, all of that stuff, and carry on their existence. And I think, like, my understanding of what happened on 7th of October is the music festival, the kibbutzim, etc., are zone of interest. There are people who are living on the doorsteps of a huge, whatever you want to call it, outdoor prison concentration camp, where people are regularly murdered by the government of the people living in the zone of interest, where people are being starved, where people are being oppressed in multiple ways.
I've never thought of putting that together.
Yeah, I think that it's totally explicable. I didn't have, and I think sometimes there's something wrong with me emotionally. I didn't have the reaction you had. Actually, I never really felt what you're describing. I felt just that's going to happen. I got straight to that's what's going to happen if you treat people like that.
Well, you're right to think like that, but I didn't think like that, and because I had relatives, one of my relatives was a founder member of one of the kibbutz in there, and he was murdered that day. So I think there was a deeper sense of connection for me. But I think you're comparing it with zone of interest is really interesting. I have never thought of that way, but I agree with you. It has been an open prison for 20 years or more. And since 1967, it's been occupied.
Yeah. And a prison where people regularly get murdered by the government who's occupying them.
Yes, they have no independent existence.
Yeah.
And the same on the West Bank. After Zone of Interest was made, there was another film made. I don't know whether you've seen that, called The Commandant's Shadow. It's
I haven't seen that, no. I'd like to, yeah.
You should see it because it's really interesting. It's based on the same theme. It's about Rudolf Höss, who was the commandant, and who the Zone of Interest is about his house, and his children,
and his wife as well.
And his wife, and the Commandant's Shadow is about the youngest two children who are still living, and in the Commandant's Shadow, they I can't remember who made it, but the woman, the main woman in it is the daughter of the cellist in Auschwitz. So the film is about the daughter trying to meet and talk to the son of Höss, and she eventually does. But it's all about her journey of trying to reconcile. And so, given what you've just said, there is maybe subsequent generations. It'll be many generations beyond. But anyway, the film ends with the daughter and the son going to visit Auschwitz together. And it's very powerful.
Whenever I see anything that relates to the Holocaust or to walls, when I go, when I was in Berlin, I always think about what will happen when, as ultimately has to happen, there will be some shift in Israel-Palestine, right? And there will have to be some kind of reckoning. And walls get taken down eventually. I don't know how, I probably won't live to see it, but eventually.
It won't happen in my life.
Yeah, and then people have to, descendants of the people who were the colonial oppressors, the occupiers, whatever, have to reconcile with the people they brutally were brutally oppressed by in the past. And it's really disturbing because people talk very meaningfully about these things and people make these very emotional films. And yet, whenever anybody makes a connection to what's happening now in Israel-Palestine or in other conflicts, people refuse that connection. I think we'll draw us to close, but what I think is really, what I hope people get from this is, I hope people get something from it. That's always good. I hope people get also the way in which, even when you move towards a position against Israel, a position that's moved away from Zionism, it's very, very hard to disentangle. And I think being honest about that is good. It isn't a smooth transition. I think I'm in quite an extreme place now compared to you, that I think I'm quite so strongly anti-Zionist now. But it is hard. It is hard.
I want to explain why I'm a non-Zionist, not an anti-Zionist.
Yeah.
Because I don't agree with your position on anti-Zionism, because I think the desire for a Jewish state was completely in line with other forms of nationalism. And so I thought that was okay. But the desire for a Palestinian or Arab state is still the case, and I think they should be afforded their state too, or perhaps the aim of a binational state might have worked, but it didn't for all sorts of reasons. But you wouldn't say you're not British just because you disagree with them.
No, but the reason why I'm anti-Zionist is because I don't think that nationalism is in line. I think that as soon as you make a settler colonial enterprise in a place where you're not the majority, you have to create an ethno-state. And I am against ethno-states. Britain is a state for all its citizens. There's lots of problems with that. There's lots of racism in the British state, obviously, but the laws do not discriminate. The laws in Israel necessarily discriminate. The processes have to discriminate. I'm against anything that necessarily has to be an ethno-state, and a Jewish state has to be an ethno-state.
I take your point.
Yeah.
But there are, if you think about other states that were founded around the time of Israel, like Bangladesh, or India and Pakistan. Well, Bangladesh was later, but those are carved out of the bigger states, and they have attempted to give a form of nationalism to a group, and there aren't any.
But India, for example, its constitution, and there's real problems with Modi, and there's real problems with it becoming much more of an ethno-state now. But historically, and its founding, India was a state for all its citizens. It had a constitution. One of the reasons Israel has never had a constitution is because it's impossible for it to do it. Because it wants to be an ethno-state. It has to necessarily.
Yeah, but
it cannot create that. And that makes it different.
But so did the United Kingdom, in a way, want ethno-states, because it didn't want the Scottish at one point. It saw the Scottish as ethnically different. And
there's lots of racism in that. That doesn't make it an ethno-state. It doesn't mean that it's... I don't think you could say that Jewish nationalism is akin to the nationalisms, the anti-colonial nationalisms that you're comparing it to, like in India.
Well, I need to think about that.
I think it really is on the side of the colonial powers. It was really doing the work. I understand that for individuals that we've talked about, it was a left-wing project, it was a real project, but actually politically, the way it aligns is with colonial powers, is taking over an area which they knew they had to vacate, which they'd had power over in the Middle East, and putting a little bit of Europe there and serving colonial interests. So
from my point of view, though, there's some of my family did settle in Israel in the 16th century in Sfat, and Sfat has been a Jewish town in there. But you're right; it wasn't the majority population.
And that settling was not based on a takeover.
No, it wasn't.
It was a very different form of
coexistence. I think the question of coexistence is what the problem was, but I blame the Brits for that rather than the Jewish settlers. The Brits did then stoke the conflict between Jews and Arabs. There is no question in my mind that is what happened in the 30 years before Israel was established.
Certainly all of that is true. Certainly the British bear a huge responsibility. But if you look at the writings of early Zionism, it was a explicitly settler colonial project. There was an acknowledgement of the need to ethnically cleanse. that was a project of the Socialist Labour leaders of the Jewish state prior to it setting up in the 40s and post it setting up all the way through. And I don't think you can use, I don't think the British Constitution excludes the fact that this nationalism it's not a nationalism that I think we can live with within Judaism.
Well, I think you're right about questions of social justice and equality between different groups. So I'm going to think about my arguments and read some more. But I'm not absolutely convinced, because I think we're now into several generations living there. But I do agree with you that the main question that has to be addressed is the coexistence,
Equality.
It has to be political and social equality for those people living there.
From the river to the sea.
Yes.
Absolutely. Equality. That is a good note to end. I actually want to thank you. I think this has been a very good conversation. It's different than the conversations I've had on the channel before. I think it's very easy to be quite aggressive towards Jewish people, and I think that probably I'm down with that most of the time, but also it's good for people to understand when people are on journeys and different stages of those journeys, because
I'm really grateful for you suggesting this.
Yeah, it was nice. We had a kind of train journey from Cambridge to London together, and that's how it came up. And it was great. And I'm going to turn the recording off now and say thank you, and say thank you for watching. If you found anything of value in this, obviously please like and share this video, put comments below. We'd be really interested to hear what you have to say. Whether you'd welcome other conversations like this, do tell me, or other videos. Huge thank you for watching, and goodbye.